Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on, well, a massive intellectual journey.
You could say that.
We're doing a deep dive into a concept that is, you could argue, the central character in the human story. We're talking about the divine.
And we're going to be tracing the evolution of God across nearly 4,000 years.
Yeah, using Karen Armstrong's absolutely monumental work, A History of God, as our guide.
And I think it's a critical dive for anyone, really, regardless of what your personal belief system is, because we all come into this conversation with this huge, pervasive cultural assumption.
Which is what? That God is the ultimate constant.
Exactly. That God is this immutable, static thing, a fixed point in an ever-changing universe. And that the history of religion is just, the history of humans trying and often failing to grasp that one fixed point.
Right. That's the classic view. We think God just is like this solid, objective thing out there, and all of theology is just us trying to get a clearer picture of it.
But Armstrong's fundamental counter-thesis, and this is really the engine of our whole deep dive today, is that God is not some static object waiting to be discovered.
It's a creative concept.
It's a creative concept. She frames the divine not as a fixed reality that never changes, but as an idea that humanity is constantly inventing and evolving and reinventing.
Sculpting it almost?
Yes, sculpting it based on immediate historical needs, cultural demands, and this is the most critical part, moments of intense collective trauma.
So to put it bluntly, humanity didn't just discover God.
We invented the concept of God.
Yeah.
And the biography of that invention, that's the history we're tracking today.
So our mission then is to follow that biography, to understand the powerful, sometimes catastrophic forces that made the definition of the divine shift so dramatically over the millennia.
Right.
We need to know why the Yahweh of the ancient Hebrew tribes looks so radically different from, say, the distant abstract God of the medieval philosophers.
Or the intensely personal mystical God of the Kabbalists. What was the need for that change?
Exactly. What was the need?
And understanding that need is so crucial for you, the listener, today. Because Armstrong argues that when an old definition of God stops providing meaning...
When it stops working.
When it stops working.
Right.
When it fails to comfort or inspire justice or just make sense intellectually, it becomes spiritually useless.
But the religious impulse, that doesn't just vanish.
No, not at all. Instead, the concept of the divine is discarded, and humanity is sort of immediately compelled to build a new symbol, a new theology, one that can actually speak to the traumas and complexities of life now.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yep.
And to really get the weight of this argument, we have to start with Armstrong's own story. Her entry point into this whole history is deeply, deeply personal.
It is. She was a former Catholic nun.
And she ultimately left her order.
Her personal stakes here really establish her credibility, I think, and the urgency of her analysis. She describes the God she was taught, the one that eventually drove her out of the convent, as a distant authoritarian dictator.
And that definition, for her, just didn't work anymore. It was intellectually cold, emotionally detached.
It had ceased to make any spiritual sense for her. It was, in her words, a failure of the symbol.
So the symbol of God she was handed, this rigid, distant figure, it just failed to meet her profound spiritual needs.
Right.
And the crucial world-shifting insight she got from studying history wasn't that faith was impossible. It was that the definition of what she was supposed to have faith in, that was the problem.
And she realized these definitions are fluid. They're not rigid, objective scientific facts.
And this, for me, is the most powerful takeaway from her work.
It's huge. Definitions of God are not facts. They are symbols.
Symbols.
She insists that God is not scientific truth, but is, in her words, man-made art.
Man-made art. I love that.
It's a creative effort, you know? It's designed to express awe, to articulate something transcendent that our ordinary language just can't capture. Symbols are how we try to manage the unmanageable.
To name the unnameable.
Exactly. To articulate a reality that lies way beyond empirical data.
So when that symbol, that piece of human art, stops working, when it stops inspiring awe or providing comfort, or, and this is critical, when it stops pushing us towards justice and ethical action, it fails.
It becomes inert. It becomes an idol, really, that has to be broken so that a new, more effective symbol can be built in its place.
It's like a theological version of creative destruction.
That's a great way to put it. It's driven by our basic human need for meaning. And if we can keep that idea, God, as an evolving symbol, a creative work that's always being updated, if we keep that in our minds, then the 4,000-year history we're about to cover stops looking like a messy, random collection of beliefs.
And starts looking like what?
A single, continuous logical argument.
All right, so let's begin that grand biography of belief at the starting line. Section 1, the genesis of the divine concept.
Okay.
If we trace the roots of the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They emerge from the sprawling, kind of chaotic pantheons of the ancient Near East.
That's absolutely right. These traditions didn't start with strict monotheism as we think of it. Not at all. They started, like pretty much every other culture, with these remote cosmic deities, the so-called sky gods.
Okay, so what is a sky god?
Think of figures who were responsible for, creating the cosmos, setting the rules of physics and existence.
Mm-hmm.
But then they basically withdrew. They set it all in motion and then stepped back.
I can immediately see the spiritual problem with that.
Right.
If your main god is too remote, too busy running the infinite cosmos, he becomes totally inaccessible for the average person who's just struggling with, daily life.
Precisely. The sky gods were great for explaining the origin of the world, the grand why, but they were terrible at providing a meaningful spiritual life or practical help, or any sense of involvement in your day-to-day affairs.
Yeah, when your crops are failing or a neighboring tribe is about to attack.
Right.
Appealing to some distant cosmic force that set the universe spinning millennia ago isn't very comforting or effective.
Not at all. So what happens is the average worshiper shifts their devotion. They replace these distant, sort of indifferent sky gods with deities who are local, accessible, and engaged.
And we see this with figures like who? Baal.
Baal is the perfect example.
Yeah.
The Canaanite storm and fertility god. Baal was active. You could appeal to him for immediate rain, for success in the harvest, for military protection. He was a practical, invested deity.
So this shift is really the first big step, recognizing the human need for an engaged divine.
It is, and this need sets the stage for the real game changer in this history, the emergence of the Israelites and their relationship with Yahweh.
Now, this is where we make a huge mistake, right? When we read the earliest texts, like the Book of Exodus, we tend to project our modern universal idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing God back onto that early evidence.
We do, and it creates a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Armstrong is meticulous here, showing that the early Yahweh was a radically different being than the universal creator God of later philosophical theology. Well, the sources show that Yahweh started as something much more limited and much more intensely passionate and specific. He was a tribal war deity.
A war deity, not a transcendent creator who exists outside of time.
Not yet. He was an active, interventionist, passionate champion for a specific group of people.
A fiercely partisan champion, it sounds like.
Intensely passionate and partisan, yes. He's often referred to as Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of Hosts, or the Lord of Armies. His main job, when the concept first solidified, was military and political.
So securing victory, establishing their land, ensuring the prosperity of this one tribal group, Israel?
That was the deal. The initial relationship was entirely transactional, built on a covenant.
It almost sounds like a mutual protection racket. We only worship you, and in return, you make sure we win our battles and survive.
It was a very pragmatic and fierce arrangement. And here's the initial constraint that's so crucial for tracking this evolution. Early Yahweh was not yet the only God in existence.
Ah, okay. This is the big distinction between henotheism and monotheism.
Precisely. Early Israelite faith was a system of henotheism, the belief in many gods, but the exclusive worship of only one chosen deity.
So the early Israelites didn't deny that Baal was real, or Chemosh of Moab, or the gods of the other nations?
No, they didn't deny their existence at all. They just understood that their tribal deity, Yahweh, would not tolerate any rivals in their own worship.
This is why the first commandment isn't other gods don't exist.
It's you shall have no other gods before me. It's a statement about loyalty, not ontology.
That subtle difference in wording is actually huge. It means Yahweh's power was initially tied to his tribal loyalty, and the competition with other gods was real.
Absolutely. His success was measured by Israel's military success. The symbol was powerful, it provided focus and a strong national identity, but only as long as Israel was winning.
Which highlights the fragility of that early symbol.
It does. Because what happens when the geopolitical ground shakes? If your concept of God is tied directly to battlefield victories and national dominance,
how do you process a crushing existential defeat at the hands of those other nations and their gods?
And that catastrophic failure, that is the necessary precondition for the next great spiritual leap.
That dramatic failure brings us right to Section 2, which is a period I find endlessly fascinating. It's this spiritual revolution that's born from profound political trauma.
It is.
This is the moment that forces the concept of God to transform from a local partisan bodyguard into a universal moral deity, and the catalyst is the Babylonian exile.
The exile, which starts in 586 BCE, was not just a military loss. It was, for them, a complete theological annihilation.
I mean, Jerusalem, their capital, was destroyed.
The temple, which they believed was the physical dwelling place, the literal house of God on earth, was sacked and ruined. And the ruling and religious elites were all forcibly deported to Babylon.
So if the covenant was military, this disaster should have meant the theological death of Yahweh. The gods of Babylon, like Marduk, should have, demonstrably won.
That's a logical conclusion.
So how do the survivors reconcile their concept of an all-powerful partisan god with total national failure and enslavement? This is the point where that symbol should have just shattered forever.
It was an absolute existential crisis. If the old interpretation was correct, that Yahweh was just a powerful tribal patron, then there were only two possibilities.
He was either weaker than the Babylonian gods, or he had completely abandoned them.
Either way, the religion is over. The religious structure needed a radical rescue operation.
And this is where the genius of the prophets comes in. Figures like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they had this impossible intellectual task of synthesizing the trauma, of creating a new narrative that didn't just preserve Yahweh, but actually enhanced his power.
They executed a theological pivot that fundamentally changed Western religion forever. They couldn't say, our God was weaker, so instead they pointed the finger inward.
They said the fault wasn't with God's strength,
but with Israel's profound systemic moral failure.
So the defeat wasn't proof of God's weakness. It was proof of his absolute terrifying power and, more importantly, his demand for justice.
Exactly. The symbol of God was instantly redefined. He wasn't just a military patron anymore. He was a universal ethical sovereign. The exile became proof in their new theology, not of abandonment, but of divine judgment.
Yahweh had allowed the catastrophe to happen.
He allowed it because his people had ignored his moral laws, corrupted their society, and relied on empty rituals instead of compassion for the poor and the widow. The new God concept was that the divine passionately demanded ethical behavior.
And this immediately expanded his scope, right? I mean, if Yahweh allowed a foreign power, the Babylonians, to act as his instrument of judgment,
He had to be controlling the Babylonians too.
He's not just the God of Israel anymore. He's the orchestrator of all history, the master of every nation on earth.
The implications are just astronomical. To explain the trauma, the prophets had to make Yahweh universal. And this is the moment that strict monotheism is truly born. By the time we get to the great unnamed prophet known as Second Isaiah, the evolution is complete. Yahweh is no longer just the greatest of the gods.
He's the only God. He is the only God. There is literally no room left in the cosmos for Baal or Chemosh or even Marduk. They are declared to be nothing but idols of wood and stone.
I have to stop you there, though, and ask a critical question for the listener.
Please.
Wasn't this whole prophetic maneuver, declaring failure as proof of power, local defeat as proof of universal sovereignty, wasn't this just a brilliant piece of theological propaganda designed simply to save the religion from being wiped out?
That is precisely the cynical reading, and it's a valid one if we look at religion purely through a political lens. But Armstrong suggests that the result was something more than just survival.
Okay.
While it certainly was a survival mechanism for the faith, the new concept that emerged, the singular, universal, morally demanding God who judges empires based on justice, was inherently more sophisticated, more robust, and more ethically potent than the tribal warrior he replaced.
So the trauma didn't just save the religion.
It forced a necessary moral upgrade on the concept of the divine. The symbol was remade. From a localized warrior whose contract was military to a cosmic ethical judge whose demand was universal morality.
That's the core theme of the book. Trauma forces theological refinement. And this new framework, the singular universal God who demands justice, that's the template that will eventually underpin Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
But as we'll see, that single template gets pulled in some radically divergent directions.
It really does.
And that shift brings us into section 3, where this new universal concept of God gets interpreted and applied in two profoundly different ways. You have Christianity embracing mystery with the Trinity, while Islam champions absolute unity with Tawhid.
Right. Let's start with the Christian path. The concept of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is notoriously confusing.
It is. People try to solve it like a math problem. How can three distinct persons be one essence? Three equals one.
And this question caused centuries of brutal internal theological conflict, most famously the Arian controversy.
Could you just elaborate on that a bit? I think the context there is pretty essential for understanding why the Trinitarian doctrine ended up winning.
Of course. So Arius, an early Christian priest, argued that if God the Father created the Son, then the Son must be subordinate. There was a time when the Son was not.
So it's a logical, hierarchical definition. God is singular, and the Son is a divine creature, but a lesser one.
Exactly. It made intellectual sense to a lot of people. But others feared it undermined the whole concept of salvation. Because if Christ wasn't fully God, how could he fully connect humanity to the divine?
So the church was trying to define the indefinable, and the result was just schism and these massive arguments over subtle Greek terms.
And this is where Armstrong's analysis really shines. For the winners of that debate, especially the very influential Greek-speaking Cappadocian fathers, the Trinitarian doctrine was never intended to be a logical solution to a math problem.
So what was it?
It was declared a mystery precisely to neutralize those kinds of rationalist arguments, like the ones from Arius.
So a mystery, then, wasn't a problem waiting for a rational answer. It was more like a conceptual defense mechanism.
Exactly. Its purpose was purely spiritual and pedagogical. The Cappadocian Fathers saw the Trinity as a poetic paradigm, a beautiful, non-rational structure intended specifically to inspire awe and humility.
To stop people from trying to rationalize God.
Yes. The moment you try to rationalize God, to reduce him to a rigid definition that fits neatly into a syllogism, you've reduced the infinite. You've created an idol.
So the very complexity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was designed to prevent humanity from trying to box God in, from turning the infinite into a finite, easily digestible category.
It's meant to be experienced in awe, not proven in a debate hall. It serves as an immediate anti-literalist mechanism, baked right into the central doctrine. It's a mechanism that basically says, stop. Stop trying to define God with the precision of empirical science. He must remain transcendent and beyond our grasp to be a source of inexhaustible meaning.
Okay, so now let's fast forward a few centuries to the 7th century. The path taken by Islam offers a radically different solution to this problem of divine complexity.
Radically different.
If Christianity chose complexity as a way to protect transcendence, Islam chose absolute, uncompromising clarity.
This is the revolutionary power of Islam's core message. The Prophet Muhammad preached Tawhid.
Which means?
It's the absolute return to strict Semitic unity. The message is a deliberate rejection of the complexities that were introduced by the Christian Trinity and all the clutter of the surrounding polytheisms. The statement is crystal clear. There is no deity but Allah. Singular, indivisible, incomparable.
This intense focus on singularity Tawhid, that must have just stripped away centuries of accumulated philosophical and theological arguments?
It created an immediate clarity, and this clarity shaped the very experience of the sacred text itself. Armstrong highlights that the Quran is not just a written rulebook or a series of historical stories.
It's designed through its structure, its rhyme, its linguistic power.
As an auditory experience of the divine, the sound, the rhythm, the act of recitation, it's meant to be overwhelming, direct, and to provide an immediate, unmediated encounter with the one singular God.
And crucially, this strict unity, this powerful intellectual concept, it didn't just lead to some esoteric, detached philosophical pursuit.
No, it immediately translated into the central socio-religious concept of Islam.
The creation of a just society.
The unity of God must be reflected in the unity of humanity. If God is singular and just, his followers must establish a singular and just community. Religion in early Islam was intensely practical and social.
So creating the just society, the Ummah, that was seen as the central sacrament.
It was. Faith was defined by action. How you conduct your business, how you treat the poor, how you define relationships with your neighbor.
So we have two very different theological strategies here, both rooted in that post-exilic ethical monotheism.
We do.
Christianity uses the paradigm of mystery to protect God's transcendence from rational reduction.
While Islam uses absolute unity, Tawhid, to make sure that the practical, ethical application of faith, compassion, and justice is always paramount.
And both were profoundly successful attempts to update the symbol of God to keep it relevant and meaningful for their cultures.
Yes, but the battle lines were about to be drawn, and the greatest internal tension in the history of this whole concept emerges next. The struggle between the head and the heart, between logic and experience.
That intellectual and spiritual conflict brings us to Section 4, the central battleground. This tension between logic and transcendence, it dominates the Middle Ages, and it fundamentally defines the crisis that would eventually lead to the modern collapse of the concept of God.
We're talking about the deep-seated rivalry between the philosophers and the mystics. This battle is the clearest expression of Armstrong's central dynamic. This struggle between defining God as a knowable thing,
A proposition to be proven,
versus experiencing God as an unknowable reality.
a state of being.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with the philosophical camp. These are the intellectual giants, right? Across all three traditions.
That's right. Christian scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, and the Muslim rationalists who were known as the Philosophers.
And what was the driving force behind their theology? What were they trying to do?
Well, their core goal was driven by the rediscovery of Greek Aristotelian logic. They wanted to prove God's existence using pure, irrefutable reason. They saw faith as potentially, shaky, based on emotion or ancient stories, and they wanted to elevate belief to the level of undeniable scientific certainty.
So they were trying to make God logically necessary, mathematically certain, irrespective of any revelation or personal experience.
Precisely. They wanted to strip away everything anecdotal or miraculous or emotional and just reduce God to the bare minimum concept required by intellectual necessity. But in doing so, they created a very dry, cold result.
The first cause, the unmoved mover. It sounds like the philosophers successfully created a perfectly working clock, but in all their intellectual rigor, they forgot that most people want a relationship with the clockmaker, not just the timepiece.
That is a perfect analogy. The unmoved mover was logically sound, demonstrable through 5 ways, perhaps, but spiritually sterile. It was a God you could assent to intellectually. You could agree he existed because logic demanded it, but you certainly couldn't love him or talk to him or feel his presence in your daily life.
And this philosophical reduction created a spiritual void.
It did. And as we've learned, when a definition of God fails to fulfill the spiritual and emotional needs of the worshiper,
A rebellion follows.
rebellion follows. This was the emergence of the mystical path. The Sufis in Islam, the Kabbalists in Judaism, and various monastic and contemplative orders in Christianity.
And they represented a radical rejection of that whole rational premise.
Completely. The mystics insisted that God is not a fact to be proven. He is an experience to be cultivated, reached through deep contemplation, self-annihilation, personal struggle. They argued that trying to confine God within human language or logic was, in itself, an act of profound spiritual hubris.
And this is where their language becomes so shocking but so insightful. They preferred to refer to the ultimate reality of God as nothing.
Right, and this wasn't a statement of nihilism or disbelief.
Yeah.
It was an extreme form of reverence designed to protect the transcendence of the divine. To call God a being, they argued, immediately limits him. It places him within the finite category of existence alongside other beings like you or me or a tree.
In Kabbalah, God in his absolute essence is called Ein Sof.
Which means without end, or the infinite nothing.
It's a conceptual paradox. It's designed to force your mind to let go of concrete images.
They're saying, the moment you visualize God or label God, you've created an idol. The concept of nothing forces the believer back to the core idea that God is a symbol for a reality that utterly transcends our comprehension.
The mystics understood this profound, tragic irony.
They did. If you define God too well, if you make him logically certain and finite, you kill the spiritual life. They sought union, not proof.
The source material gives us this stunning example of how this mystical, symbolic approach provided actual spiritual and psychological healing to a deeply traumatized community. I'm talking about the Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum.
Tzimtzum is fascinating. It emerged in the 16th century, specifically in the Jewish community, that was reeling from the brutal trauma of the expulsion from Spain.
So they were dispersed, exiled, facing just utter desolation.
And the existential question became, if God is everywhere, if he is truly infinite and omnipresent, why is there so much suffering? And where are we, his chosen people, living in exile?
It's the ultimate theological paradox. How can an infinite good God allow suffering and exile?
And the mystics, instead of offering a literal explanation, they gave a healing metaphor. Tzimtzum means contraction or withdrawal. The metaphor suggests that for creation to even occur, God, who is infinite, had to metaphorically shrink himself, to withdraw a portion of his light and his presence, in order to make space for the world, for finite existence, and crucially, for human free will.
Which allows for both good and inevitably evil and suffering.
Right, so the community's exile and tragedy weren't God's arbitrary failure or punishment, but a necessary consequence of his self-limitation for the sake of existence itself. God, in a sense, sacrificed part of his infinite presence to allow space for humanity.
It's a powerful healing narrative.
Incredibly powerful. It reframed the community's trauma not as arbitrary abandonment, but as participation in a cosmic drama of divine contraction. This metaphor gave them profound meaning in the face of despair. It presented a God who shares in the vulnerability and incompleteness of the world.
Not the dry, detached first cause that the philosophers offered.
And that is the ultimate function of the divine symbol, to provide existential meaning and healing in times of crisis.
This mystical, symbolic understanding, the very one that provided healing and prevented idolatry, was exactly what the Enlightenment destroyed.
A tragic move.
It was a tragic move from profound symbolism back into rigid literalism. And that brings us to Section 5, the modern crisis and the cost of literalism.
The problem really begins when Western philosophy, driven by the revolutionary success of physics and math, became entirely obsessed with empirical methods and scientific certainty.
Suddenly, God was dragged out of the temple and into the laboratory.
And he was expected to prove his existence using the same criteria as gravity or chemistry.
This Enlightenment trap was the attempt to make the divine concept accountable to empirical methods. The symbol of God was literalized. It was treated not as a transcendent metaphor, but as a testable scientific hypothesis or a verifiable historical fact.
And we see the danger so clearly in figures like Isaac Newton. Now, Newton was a deeply religious man. He wasn't trying to disprove God, but he explicitly used the concept of God to fill the gaps in his gravitational theories and his cosmic mechanics.
He saw the precision of the universe as proof of the ultimate clockmaker.
A clockmaker who, occasionally had to intervene to reset or fine-tune the celestial mechanism. He used God as a piece of intellectual utility, an explanation for phenomena that science couldn't yet account for.
He used God to explain the how of the universe.
And this, Armstrong warns, is an incredibly dangerous game for any concept of the divine to play. When you ground your God concept in utility, when his existence is defined by his function in explaining currently unsolved natural phenomena, you create a fatal vulnerability.
Because the consequence is logically fatal. If science finds a better, more elegant, and self-contained explanation for the phenomenon, God is out of a job.
Exactly. The historical term for this is the God of the gaps. And the moment the French scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace tells Napoleon he has no need of that hypothesis to explain the solar system's mechanics, the utility God starts to crumble.
The universal ethical God of the prophets had been replaced by this temporary placeholder God who was only useful until a better scientific explanation came along.
And the gaps just kept shrinking exponentially. Darwin explained the origin of life without divine intervention. Geology explained the age of the earth, contradicting literal readings of Genesis.
And higher textual criticism dissected the Bible itself, proving it was a collection of human documents edited over time, not some single, immutable divine dictation.
So by the 19th century, the cultural and intellectual edifice supporting that literal, rationalized God of the philosophers had collapsed. The concept, stripped of its mystical and symbolic depth, was entirely vulnerable to empirical refutation.
And this culminates in those famous existential declarations of death. Nietzsche proclaims that God is dead.
And Freud dismisses religion as a neurotic illusion, just a wish fulfillment projected onto the cosmos.
And Armstrong pinpoints the fundamental reason for this collapse. It's that humanity, especially in the West, had lost the vital, symbolic, mystical understanding of the divine that the Sufis and Kabbalists had championed.
What was left was the dry, literal, rigid idol. The one the philosophers had created and the scientists had tested and found wanting. And this literal idol could not withstand the demands of the modern, scientific, skeptical world. It failed utterly to evolve.
The essential lesson of this entire 4,000-year history seems to be this. The moment the definition of the divine becomes rigid, the symbol dies.
And the spiritual life of the community is fundamentally threatened. Rigidity is the death of meaningful religion. The moment you insist that your metaphor, your man-made art, is a literal finite fact, you stop engaging with transcendence. You turn the concept into a human-sized object that can be easily refuted and discarded.
So we've traced this incredible evolution from a tribal war chief through an ethical judge, a logical first cause, and a mystical nothing. We've seen the symbol of God constantly being remade in the crucible of trauma and new knowledge. As we synthesize this history, what does this constant evolution suggest for us today?
The synthesis, I think, is that the history of God is inextricably linked to the history of humanity itself. The concept of the divine acts as a mirror. It's constantly changing, constantly being reinvented by thinkers and mystics and prophets to provide meaning in the face of new challenges.
Whether they be political defeat, philosophical enlightenment, or scientific revolution, it's a history of necessary, relentless reinvention.
It is.
But in the modern world, the most visible response to the collapse of that literal, rational God has been a defensive, sometimes violent retreat.
And Armstrong sees contemporary fundamentalism, and not just in one tradition, but across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as a panicked reaction to this existential loss of meaning.
A panic reaction caused by the failure of the literal God.
Yes. When the modern world makes the old concept impossible to believe in, the fundamental response isn't to update the symbol. It's to rigidly cling to a literal, inerrant reading of ancient texts, mistaking the symbol for the ultimate, transcendent reality.
And what we've seen historically is that this rigidity only guarantees the eventual irrelevance of the concept. It creates a closed system in a world that is constantly opening up new knowledge.
That is the ultimate danger. So Armstrong's suggested path forward, drawing on the deepest insights from the mystics and the prophets, is a return to a symbolic understanding.
To view God not as a being to be proven or a fact to be defended,
but as a symbol for a reality that is infinitely beyond us. One that we can access through spiritual experience, through awe, and critically, through compassionate, ethical action in the world.
the goal then isn't to engage in the impossible task of finding a rational proof for God.
No.
It's to focus on the ethical practice inspired by the symbol of the divine, to create the ummah, the just society, regardless of the precise definition of the unmoved mover.
The crucial universal lesson this 4,000-year history provides is that the concept of God should function as a source of connection and ethical living, a mechanism for humility and compassion.
Because when we use the divine concept to rationalize injustice or to defend rigid definitions,
Or worse, as a being we fight wars over.
the symbol has utterly failed its primary humanitarian purpose. It has become destructive rather than inspiring.
It's truly a remarkable narrative arc, from a local tribal war chief defined by military success to an abstract mystical reality that transcends definition and demands justice and peace above all else.
It forces us to apply this principle of necessary reinvention universally.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. We've seen that the concept of the divine, this ultimate category of human meaning, must constantly evolve under the pressure of new knowledge and new trauma to survive and remain morally relevant.
So we ask you, what current human concept outside of religion that you rely on for defining your life or your society is currently failing to provide meaning?
Think about our modern, rigid definitions of success, or the relentless pursuit of economic growth, or even certain structures of governance. Which of those concepts are currently literalized, unexamined idols that are causing profound collective trauma rather than healing it?
And which of those fundamental ideas are ripe for a radical reinterpretation, a philosophical Tzimtzum that will require us to admit that we need a new symbol, a new piece of art to lead us toward a more compassionate and sustainable future?
The history of God proves that adaptation is not just possible, but required. That's the enduring legacy of this 4,000-year history. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.